Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in October 1962, remains one of the most tense and perilous moments in Cold War history. The crisis was triggered when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This revelation not only brought the two superpowers, the US and the USSR, to the brink of war, but also marked a defining moment in the struggle between democracy and communism that defined the Cold War. The situation was more than just a political standoff. It represented the very real threat of nuclear war. For 13 days, the world held its breath as President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in tense negotiations, with both nations on high, alert and preparing for potential military conflict. The presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba altered the balance of power, putting millions of people at risk. It brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to direct confrontation than at any other point in the Cold War, with the looming possibility of nuclear missiles being launched, either intentionally or by miscalculation. The stakes were incredibly high because the presence of nuclear weapons on both sides of the conflict meant that any wrong move could lead to a global catastrophe. The U.S. government feared that the Soviet Union's missile placement would severely compromise America's strategic military position, particularly given that the U.S. already had missiles in Europe and Turkey that could strike the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for its part, saw the U.S.'s nuclear presence as a threat to its own security and felt justified in placing missiles in Cuba as a means of counterbalance. The fear of mutually assured destruction, the idea that both sides could annihilate each other with nuclear weapons, was never more real. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrated the precariousness of the global situation. It was a critical test of diplomatic skill, patience, and the ability to manage nuclear threats without resorting to war. The crisis ended in a tense but successful negotiation where both superpowers agreed to remove their missiles. The Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. However, the world was left with a sobering realization of just how close humanity had come to nuclear war. It was a stark reminder of the need for careful diplomacy, de-escalation strategies, and the continuous pursuit of peace in a world armed with weapons capable of destroying civilization. The Cold War, which spanned from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was a period of intense geopolitical rivalry between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This ideological, political, and military struggle was rooted in the contrasting systems of governance and economic structures of the two nations, capitalist democracy versus communist dictatorship. The Cold War was not a direct military conflict between the US and the USSR, but rather a battle for global influence that played out through proxy wars, arms races, and diplomatic confrontations. At the end of World War II, the world was left divided into spheres of influence controlled by the victorious powers. The Allies had defeated the Axis powers, but the question of how to rebuild the war-torn world was fraught with tension. The US and the Soviet Union, once allies during the war, found themselves increasingly at odds over how to shape the post-war order. The Yalta Conference of February 1945, held between Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, was a key moment in setting the stage for the Cold War. While the three leaders worked to ensure the defeat of Nazi Germany, discussions also revealed deep ideological differences. The Soviets wanted to expand their influence in Eastern Europe and secure a buffer zone of friendly communist governments, while the US and Britain hoped for democratic governments in the region. This disagreement would lead to the division of Europe, symbolized by the creation of the Iron Curtain, the political and ideological barrier that separated the communist East from the capitalist West. The immediate aftermath of the war saw the US and the USSR emerge as the two dominant superpowers, each with their own vision for the future. As the Soviet Union expanded its influence in Eastern Europe, establishing communist regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the U.S. became increasingly concerned about the spread of communism worldwide. This concern led to the policy of containment, which sought to prevent the spread of Soviet communism by supporting anti-communist regimes and movements around the globe. The doctrine of containment would guide U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War, leading to involvement in various conflicts and proxy wars, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The arms race was another key component of the Cold War. Both superpowers recognized the devastating power of nuclear weapons, and each sought to develop a stockpile of these weapons capable of ensuring their security and asserting dominance. The first significant event in this arms race was the development of the atomic bomb by the United States during World War II. In 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender and ending the war in the Pacific. However, by 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending the U.S.'s monopoly on nuclear weapons. This development shifted the balance of power and set off a nuclear arms race, with both sides engaging in a technological and military race to build more powerful and more numerous nuclear weapons. The threat of mutual assured destruction, MAD, the idea that both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, became a key deterrent against direct conflict, even as tensions between the two superpowers continued to rise. Global. Tension during the Cold War was not limited to the U.S. and the USSR alone. Both superpowers sought to expand their spheres of influence, often using other nations as pawns in their struggle for supremacy. This led to numerous proxy wars where the U.S. and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. For example, the Korean War, 1950-1953, was a direct result of Cold War tensions, with the U.S. supporting the South Korean government and the USSR and China backing the Communist North. Similarly, the Vietnam War, 1955-1975, saw the U.S. supporting the South Vietnamese government in its fight against the Communist North, which was supported by the Soviet Union and China. These proxy wars were often brutal and devastating for the countries involved, but they reflected the global nature of the Cold War rivalry. In addition to military confrontations, the Cold War also played out in the realm of ideology, with both superpowers seeking to demonstrate the superiority of their respective political and economic systems. The U.S. promoted liberal democracy, free market capitalism, and individual freedoms, while the Soviet Union championed socialism, state control of the economy, and the supremacy of the Communist Party. This ideological divide influenced nearly every aspect of international relations, from the formation of military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, to the establishment of rival organizations like the United Nations and the Non-Aligned Movement, as nations around the world had to choose sides or navigate the tense space between the two superpowers. In conclusion, the Cold War was characterized by intense ideological and geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Key events such as the Yalta Conference set the stage for the division of Europe and the subsequent arms race, while the U.S.'s policy of containment led to numerous proxy wars across the globe. The Cold War was defined by a global tension that shaped political, military, and cultural developments for much of the 20th century, with the threat of nuclear war casting a long shadow over the entire period. Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba in 1959 marked a seismic shift in both Cuban politics and the broader geopolitics of the Cold War. Prior to Castro's revolution, Cuba had been ruled by the authoritarian government of Fulgencio Batista, which was seen as corrupt and heavily influenced by American interests. Batista's regime was unpopular, especially among the Cuban working class and intellectuals, and this created an opening for Castro and his guerrilla fighters. With a message of social justice and anti-imperialism, Castro mobilized the Cuban population to overthrow the Batista government. His revolution was supported by a wide array of Cubans who were disillusioned with the status quo and sought change. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and Castro took control, becoming the Prime Minister of Cuba. At first, Castro's government wasn't explicitly aligned with the Soviet Union, but his rhetoric and policies quickly signaled a dramatic shift towards socialism and, later, communism. As Castro sought to address deep-seated issues such as poverty, illiteracy, and inequality in Cuba, he implemented sweeping reforms, nationalizing industries and redistributing land. These moves alarmed the United States, which had significant economic and political interests in Cuba. Cuba's proximity to the U.S., just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, meant that any shift towards communism was viewed as a direct threat by the American government, especially during the height of the Cold War when the U.S. was committed to containing the spread of communism around the world. Castro's government soon began to align itself with the Soviet Union, a strategic decision that strengthened Cuba's position, but also brought it into direct conflict with the U.S. The Soviet Union, eager to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere and exploit the opportunity created by the American-backed defeat of the Batista regime, was quick to support Castro's Cuba. In the early 1960s, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev provided Cuba with economic aid and military support, including weapons and training for Castro's armed forces. Castro's move toward communism, along with his willingness to accept Soviet aid, signaled that Cuba was not only seeking to rid itself of American influence, but also aligning itself with the global communist movement. The U.S. response to the Cuban Revolution and Castro's alignment with the USSR was one of intense hostility. Washington feared that the Cuban Revolution would serve as a model for other Latin American countries, many of which were suffering from inequality and economic instability, and might also turn towards socialism or communism. The U.S. government, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower and later President John F. Kennedy, saw this as a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, which had long asserted that the Americas should remain free of European intervention and ideologically communist influence. One of the most infamous American attempts to remove Castro from power came in April 1961 with the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. The U.S. CIA, under the Eisenhower administration, trained and supported a group of Cuban exiles who had fled the country after Castro's rise to power. These exiles, known as the Brigade 2506, were tasked with landing on the southern coast of Cuba and sparking an uprising against Castro's government. The hope was that this would be the beginning of a broader revolution, toppling Castro and returning Cuba to a pro-American government. However, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster from the outset. The CIA's planning was flawed, and the U.S. underestimating Castro's popularity and military strength played a crucial role in the failure. When the exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, they were met with strong resistance from Cuban forces, including Soviet-trained troops, and the invasion quickly collapsed. The U.S. government, under Kennedy, failed to provide the necessary air support for the exiles, further ensuring their defeat. Within days, the invasion was a complete failure, and the exiles were either killed or captured. Castro used the failure to strengthen his hold on power and denounced the U.S. as an imperialist aggressor. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration and solidified Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union. The U.S. failure to oust Castro, combined with the growing Soviet support for Cuba, pushed the U.S. into a more aggressive stance. This culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to a direct confrontation between the U.S. and the USSR. The failure of the Bay of Pigs, in many ways, set the stage for the superpower rivalry that would define Cold War relations in the coming years, with Cuba serving as a key flashpoint in the larger battle between communism and capitalism. In summary, the Cuban Revolution marked a critical moment in Cold War history, as it brought Cuba into the Soviet sphere and deepened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Castro's shift towards communism and his alliance with the USSR were direct challenges to U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere, and the subsequent Bay of Pigs invasion underscored the intense conflict between the two superpowers. The failure of the invasion and the rise of Cuba as a communist stronghold just off the U.S. coast highlighted the global stakes of the Cold War, setting the stage for even greater confrontations to come. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba in October 1962 was one of the most perilous moments in the Cold War, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear conflict. The role of U.S. intelligence, particularly the U-2 reconnaissance flights, was central in uncovering this critical information. The U-2, a high-altitude spy plane, had been conducting routine surveillance over Cuba in the weeks leading up to the discovery. On October 14, 1962, one of these flights captured clear photographs of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, revealing that the Soviet Union was deploying medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles on the island. These missiles were capable of reaching large portions of the United States, including key cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and much of the eastern seaboard. The discovery was a shock to the Kennedy administration and a grave threat to U.S. national security. The strategic significance of the Soviet missiles in Cuba was immense. With Cuba being just 90 miles from Florida, these missiles would significantly reduce the warning time for the United States in the event of a nuclear attack. Unlike the long-range Soviet missiles based in the USSR, these Cuban-based missiles would be capable of reaching American targets within minutes, putting millions of lives at risk. Additionally, the presence of nuclear missiles so close to U.S. territory represented a direct challenge to U.S. power and authority, signaling that the Soviet Union was willing to escalate the Cold War to a dangerous new level. The immediate reaction from President John F. Kennedy and his administration was one of alarm, but also of caution. The Kennedy administration had to balance the need to protect American security with the risks of triggering a broader nuclear conflict. On October 16th, just 2 days after the U-2 flight, Kennedy was informed of the discovery. In a series of meetings, he and his closest advisors, later known as the ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council, deliberated over how to respond. The stakes were extremely high. Any misstep could lead to full-scale nuclear war. Kennedy was faced with several options, including an airstrike to destroy the missile sites or a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But these options carried the risk of provoking the Soviet Union into retaliation. In an effort to avoid immediate military escalation, Kennedy chose a more measured response. On October 22nd, he addressed the American public, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval blockade, which he termed a quarantine, of the island. The blockade was intended to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba and to give the U.S. time to explore diplomatic options. Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle the missile sites and remove the weapons, warning that the United States would consider any nuclear missile launch from Cuba as an act of war. The discovery of the Soviet missiles in Cuba immediately set off a tense and high-stakes standoff. Over the next few days, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a dangerous game of diplomacy, military posturing, and brinkmanship. In addition to the blockade, Kennedy sought support from U.S. allies, as well as from the United Nations, to put pressure on the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, initially denied the presence of missiles in Cuba and accused the United States of aggressive intentions. The world watched as the two superpowers faced off in a tense global showdown. Behind the scenes, secret communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev played a crucial role in diffusing the crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters, with both leaders ultimately seeking a peaceful resolution, albeit for different reasons. Khrushchev was under significant pressure from his own military and hardline officials who were urging him to escalate the situation, while Kennedy faced pressure from his military advisors who advocated for a more aggressive response. After several days of intense negotiations and close calls, both leaders agreed to a deal that defused the immediate threat of war. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev publicly agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Additionally, a secret part of the deal involved the United States agreeing to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were positioned near the Soviet border. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without direct military conflict, but it marked a turning point in Cold War diplomacy. Both superpowers came to realize the terrifying consequences of nuclear escalation, leading to the establishment of more effective communication channels such as the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and a renewed commitment to arms control negotiations. In summary, the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba was a pivotal moment in the Cold War. The intelligence provided by the U-2 reconnaissance flights revealed the Soviet Union's aggressive move to place nuclear weapons just 90 miles from U.S. soil, dramatically escalating tensions between the two superpowers. Kennedy's measured response, a combination of military pressure and diplomatic engagement, played a key role in averting a catastrophic nuclear war, but it also demonstrated the razor-thin line separating the world from disaster during the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the closest encounters with nuclear war in history, serving as a sobering reminder of the dangers of Cold War tensions. After the shocking discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy faced the immense responsibility of crafting a response that would neutralize the threat without igniting a nuclear war. After intense consultations with his advisors, in the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, Kennedy decided against an immediate military strike, which could have escalated into full-scale war. Instead, he opted for a more calculated move, a naval blockade, strategically referred to as a quarantine, to avoid the more aggressive connotation of blockade, which is typically considered an act of war under international law. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the American public in a historic televised speech. Calm but firm, he revealed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, explained the grave threat they posed to the Western Hemisphere, and announced the imposition of a quarantine around the island. He declared that any ship carrying offensive weapons bound for Cuba would be turned back by U.S. naval forces. In the same speech, Kennedy demanded the immediate dismantling and withdrawal of the missiles, and warned that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, triggering a full retaliatory response. The speech electrified the world. In the days that followed, a high-stakes diplomatic standoff unfolded. U.S. warships moved swiftly to establish the quarantine line around Cuba, intercepting and boarding Soviet ships suspected of carrying military supplies. Meanwhile, back-channel communications and formal diplomatic exchanges between Washington and Moscow became increasingly tense. The world stood on edge as Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, faced mounting pressure to either challenge the blockade, risking a direct military confrontation, or find a way to withdraw without appearing weak on the world stage. Khrushchev's initial response was defiant. In official communications, he denounced the U.S. quarantine as illegal and accused Kennedy of pushing the world toward nuclear catastrophe. Soviet ships continued to approach the quarantine line, and military forces on both sides were placed on the highest state of alert. Across the globe, governments and ordinary citizens feared that nuclear war was imminent. The United Nations also became a vital arena for the diplomatic battle. The United States took the issue to the UN Security Council, where U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson famously confronted Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin, demanding that he admit the existence of the missiles in Cuba. When Zorin refused, Stevenson presented photographic evidence captured by the U-2 spy planes, dramatically exposing Soviet deception in front of the international community. This moment further isolated the Soviet Union diplomatically and strengthened global support for the U.S. position. Behind closed doors, however, the situation was even more volatile. In private messages to Kennedy, Khrushchev alternated between conciliatory and aggressive tones, reflecting internal divisions within the U.S. Soviet leadership. Some Soviet military officials in Cuba were authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons if attacked, raising the terrifying possibility that a local conflict could spiral into an all-out nuclear exchange without direct orders from Moscow. Throughout this tense period, both Kennedy and Khrushchev showed a remarkable ability to resist pressure from their own hardliners. Both leaders understood the stakes. A miscalculation could lead to the deaths of tens of millions of people and possibly the end of civilization as they knew it. As the world held its breath, back-channel negotiations between American and Soviet officials intensified, with proposals and counter-proposals flying between Washington and Moscow. Ultimately, these diplomatic efforts would bear fruit. But in those critical days of October 1962, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. The naval quarantine, Kennedy's bold public stand, and the ability of both superpowers to engage, even under extraordinary pressure, in serious negotiation, were the factors that prevented the Cuban Missile Crisis from erupting into the most devastating war in human history. While the world watched the visible confrontation of ships and speeches, a far more delicate and secret effort was taking place behind closed doors, back-channel diplomacy that would ultimately save the world from nuclear disaster. Both President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev recognized the danger of allowing the public and military tensions to escalate unchecked. They understood that a peaceful resolution was essential, but both also needed to maintain their national pride and global standing. To navigate this delicate situation, private messages began flowing between Washington and Moscow. Using back channels, outside of the official diplomatic cables, such as contacts through Soviet journalist Alexander Fomin, a KGB officer, and American intermediaries, both sides began feeling out what concessions might be acceptable to end the standoff. Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, played a critical role. In a secret meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, Robert Kennedy conveyed that while the U.S. could not publicly agree to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, it might quietly do so within a few months after the crisis ended. In return, the Soviets would dismantle and withdraw their missiles from Cuba under UN supervision. This deal was crucial because it gave Khrushchev a way to save face. Publicly, the Soviet Union would appear to back down only under U.S. pressure regarding Cuba. Privately, however, they would secure a significant strategic gain: the removal of American nuclear missiles that directly threatened the Soviet homeland from bases in Turkey. This secret agreement was vital in persuading Khrushchev to withdraw, without appearing weak before his own hardliners in Moscow or before communist allies around the world. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were under tremendous internal pressure. In the United States, military leaders like General Curtis LeMay urged Kennedy to bomb and invade Cuba immediately, warning that the president's measured approach was dangerously weak. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev faced generals who were furious that their advantage in Cuba might be given up without a fight. Despite these tensions, both leaders demonstrated extraordinary restraint and political skill, recognizing that the stakes, nothing less than the survival of humanity, demanded a diplomatic solution. On October 26 and 27, 1962, Khrushchev sent two communications to Kennedy, one softer and emotional, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a no-invasion pledge, and the second more aggressive, demanding the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. Kennedy's advisors debated furiously about how to respond. In a carefully crafted strategy, the U.S. publicly accepted the terms of the first letter, while privately agreeing to the second demand concerning Turkey through the back channel. Thus, it was through these quiet, secret negotiations, conducted at the very edge of catastrophe, that the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. The missiles would be removed from Cuba, and the world would step back from the nuclear abyss. The success of this back-channel diplomacy demonstrated the vital importance of communication, trust-building, and creative compromise even amid the most dangerous and polarized moments in history. The Cuban Missile Crisis was filled with moments where the world stood on the edge of annihilation. Once President Kennedy announced the naval quarantine around Cuba, tensions soared. Soviet ships carrying additional missile parts and supplies steamed toward the quarantine line, and the world held its breath to see whether they would challenge the blockade, an act that could have triggered open war. American naval forces, fully armed and on high alert, were ordered to intercept any ships that crossed into the restricted zone. Every hour, news bulletins updated the public, increasing the feeling that a catastrophic confrontation was imminent. One of the most terrifying moments came on October 24, 1962, when U.S. ships and Soviet vessels came dangerously close to each other. At the last moment, however, Soviet ships either stopped or turned back, avoiding direct confrontation. It was a sign that neither side truly wanted to escalate to war, but it also highlighted just how fragile the situation was. A single miscommunication, a miscalculation, or an act of aggression by a local commander could have sparked a full-blown nuclear conflict. Behind the scenes, both militaries were at their highest alert levels. American Strategic Air Command, SAC, was at DEFCON 2, just one step away from all-out nuclear war. Nuclear bombers were airborne 24/7, ready to strike targets in the Soviet Union within minutes if ordered. In Cuba itself, Soviet commanders had operational nuclear weapons at their disposal and permission to use them if the island was invaded, something Washington was unaware of at the time. The world unknowingly came within a hair's breadth of a devastating nuclear exchange. During these intense days, communication, both formal and informal, played a vital role in preventing disaster. Messages between Washington and Moscow were carefully crafted to project strength but leave room for negotiation. Publicly, Kennedy maintained a firm stance, but privately, he and his closest advisors, including his brother Robert Kennedy, worked tirelessly to find a peaceful exit. Robert became a key figure, embodying the balance between strength and diplomacy. His back-channel meeting with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin was instrumental in opening a path to resolution. One especially harrowing incident involved a Soviet submarine, B-59, which was being hunted by U.S. Navy ships near the quarantine line. Believing war might have already begun, the submarine's captain considered launching a nuclear torpedo. Only the calm intervention of Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, who argued against launching, prevented the catastrophe. This single decision by one man helped save the world. In the end, the cooler heads prevailed. Through cautious diplomacy, back-channel, negotiations, and immense personal courage by key individuals on both sides, the immediate crisis was de-escalated. But during those 13 days of October 1962, humanity came closer to nuclear war than ever before, a stark reminder of the terrible risks of brinkmanship in the nuclear age. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis came after 13 of the most dangerous days in human history. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, agreed to dismantle and remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade the island. This agreement was broadcast to the world, allowing both sides to claim a form of victory, the U.S. for forcing the withdrawal of Soviet missiles so close to its shores, and the Soviets for securing a promise that Cuba, now a communist ally, would not face American invasion. However, behind closed doors, there was another crucial and secret part of the agreement. In addition to the public deal, President John F. Kennedy and his advisors agreed to quietly remove American Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. These missiles, stationed near the Soviet Union's borders, had long been a source of irritation for Moscow. By agreeing to remove them, the United States gave Khrushchev a face-saving way to justify his decision back home. Importantly, this part of the deal was not made public at the time and remained classified for many years, helping preserve the image that the U.S. had won the crisis without concessions. The near catastrophe exposed how dangerously close the two superpowers had come to mutual destruction simply due to slow communication and misinterpretations. As a direct result, one of the most significant outcomes of the crisis was the creation of a direct communication link between Washington, D.C., and Moscow known as the Hotline. Installed in August 1963, this teletype system allowed leaders of the U.S. and USSR to quickly communicate during emergencies, aiming to prevent future misunderstandings that could escalate into war. In the long term, the Cuban Missile Crisis deeply impacted the trajectory of the Cold War. It brought a newfound caution to U.S.-Soviet relations. Although tensions remained, both sides realized that their nuclear arsenals had made direct conflict suicidal. This mutual understanding led to a slow but real effort at arms control, including treaties like the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Politically, the crisis elevated. Kennedy's standing at home and abroad, presenting him as a steady and courageous leader. Khrushchev's position, however, was weakened. Many in the Soviet leadership viewed his handling of the crisis as a humiliation, contributing to his removal from power 2 years later. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a watershed moment. It did not end the Cold War, but it changed its nature. Both sides began to treat the nuclear balance of terror with greater seriousness, understanding that survival depended not just on power, but on restraint and diplomacy. The lessons of October 1962 would echo through the coming decades of Cold War rivalry. The legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis has profoundly shaped U.S. foreign policy, military strategy, and global diplomacy ever since. One of the most immediate impacts was a dramatic shift in how America approached international conflicts, particularly those involving nuclear powers. After coming so perilously close to nuclear war, American leaders recognized that diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and carefully calibrated responses were crucial tools for survival in a world of mutually assured destruction. The crisis instilled a more cautious, measured approach to military confrontations during the Cold War, favoring containment and strategic balance over direct escalation whenever possible. In the realm of nuclear disarmament, the Cuban Missile Crisis acted as a powerful catalyst. Both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that the unregulated buildup and testing of nuclear weapons posed a catastrophic threat to humanity. This mutual understanding led directly to the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, just a year after the crisis. The treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, marking the first major arms control agreement between the two superpowers. It was a symbolic but critical first step toward later agreements aimed at reducing the threat of nuclear war, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and later the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Beyond the realm of military policy, the Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped U.S. diplomacy in profound ways. It emphasized the importance of open communication channels between rival nations. The installation of the Washington-Moscow hotline symbolized a new era where rapid and direct dialogue became essential to crisis management. American foreign policy began to prioritize diplomatic engagement, even with adversaries, recognizing that isolation and misunderstanding could have deadly consequences. This new mindset also influenced how the U.S. dealt with conflicts across the globe, leading to a foreign policy that combined strength with an emphasis on negotiation and alliance building. The crisis also offered a lasting lesson about the role of leadership during moments of extreme danger. President John F. Kennedy's handling of the situation, marked by calm deliberation, a willingness to explore peaceful solutions, and a refusal to be rushed into military action, became a model for crisis leadership. His ability to listen to diverse viewpoints within his administration, seek secret diplomatic channels, and maintain steady public communication helped avert disaster. Similarly, Nikita Khrushchev's decision to ultimately back down and seek a negotiated settlement, despite internal pressures, demonstrated that leadership in times of peril often demands restraint rather than bravado. In retrospect, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a narrowly averted disaster, it was a turning point that forced humanity to confront the realities of the nuclear age. It left a lasting imprint on global politics, showing that true strength lies not only in military power but in wisdom, patience, and the courage to pursue peace when the world stands on the brink of destruction. The lessons learned during those tense days in October 1962 continue to guide leaders faced with the gravest of decisions even today. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, not only because of the extraordinary danger it presented, but because of the profound lessons it left behind. At its core, the crisis taught the world that nuclear war was not an abstract fear. It was a real and immediate possibility, one that could arise from miscalculation, pride, or simple misunderstanding. Leaders on both sides realized that survival in the nuclear age required something greater than military might. It required wisdom, communication, and the ability to step back from the brink, even under immense pressure. The crisis is remembered as a defining event of the Cold War because it crystallized the stakes of superpower rivalry like nothing else had before. For 13 days in October 1962, the world watched as the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a high-stakes chess match where a single wrong move could have triggered global catastrophe. It exposed the thin line between war and peace, and forced both nations to confront the terrifying consequences of their arms race. In doing so, it changed the tone of the Cold War from reckless escalation to cautious competition, where diplomacy played a central role in avoiding outright conflict. Beyond the immediate aftermath, the Cuban Missile Crisis helped shape the world order for decades to come. It led to the creation of direct communication links between rival powers, the negotiation of arms control treaties, and a greater emphasis on diplomacy over military confrontation. It also planted the seeds for future cooperation, showing that even bitter enemies could find common ground when survival was at stake. In many ways, the world we live in today, a world where major powers still engage in rivalry, but also in dialogue, was shaped by the hard-earned lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It remains a powerful reminder that in the most dangerous moments, leadership, patience, and the courage to seek peace are the true keys to securing the future.